Mabel Dawson was trying to smooth the flower stamp letters out of her dress when Mrs. Grafton stopped on the mercantile porch and began to laugh. The letters showed near the hem, faint red against the blue-brown dye her mother had boiled into the cloth. Mabel pressed her palm over them, but Mrs. Pike had already seen. Mrs. Grafton looked her up and down. "I suppose when a family runs short of cloth, even flour sacks must serve for a girl's best dress." Mrs. Pike laughed behind her glove. "At least the child will never forget what she's made of." Mabel looked down at the porch boards. She did not cry. Inside the mercantile, the open door carried the laugh to Matilda Dawson before it carried the words. Across the street, Ernest Weaver looked up from the wagon wheel he had been truing. By the time Matilda stepped outside with her parcel wrapped, Mabel's hand was pressed flat to her side seam. Matilda understood enough. She did not answer the women. She took her daughter's hand, gave a plain good morning to no one in particular, and walked her down the steps. Behind them, Mrs. Grafton lowered her voice only slightly. "I had thought of asking her to sew for the children's coats this winter, but I confess I wonder now whether a woman who dresses her own child in sacking can be trusted with good cloth." Across the street, Ernest Weaver set his mallet down beside the wagon wheel. He had not heard every word before that. He did not need to. He had heard the laugh. He had seen Mabel's hand clamp over the lettering. Now he had heard the cost. He watched Mabel walk away with her hand still pressed to the seam, and he did not go after the women. A scolding on the porch would only make the child smaller. That Monday evening, instead of walking home, Ernest went to the parsonage where Reverend Franklin kept the church books and Sunday supplies during the week. Reverend Elias Franklin had only been in town since spring, and he answered the door with flour on his sleeve, still teaching himself to bake bread since his housekeeper had taken sick, and waved Ernest in out of the cold. Ernest turned his hat over in his hands rather than sitting. "Reverend, you might speak Sunday about respect. Folks are forgetting what it costs a child to be laughed at." The pastor asked whose child and what had happened, and Ernest told him plainly, without much heat. "Widow Dawson's girl," he finished. "Matilda Dawson kept mostly to herself since her husband died." From the next room, where she had been stacking hymnals for the Sunday shelf, Mrs. Sullivan set the top book down and came to stand in the doorway, one hand still resting on the spine. "Which widow?" Ernest described the girl in the flour sack dress, the faint red letters near the hem, and Mrs. Sullivan's hand tightened on the hymnal. She set it down carefully. "I don't want to speak wrong, Reverend, but Pastor Whitcomb once told me Levi Dawson had done the church a great kindness years back. Something to do with the roof. Maybe the bell tower. It was long before you came." The pastor had heard the Dawson name once or twice, but he knew nothing behind it. He asked where the old meeting books were kept. "Cabinet behind the pulpit, if the mice have left anything worth reading." Before she went home that night, Reverend Franklin stopped her near the door. He did not ask her to carry charity. He asked whether she had any honest errand that would take her to Matilda Dawson's cabin. Mrs. Sullivan looked toward the cupboard where the church aprons lay folded. "The kitchen aprons want mending before Sunday. Matilda has done that work before, when there was wage enough for it." Reverend Franklin nodded toward the cupboard. "Then take them, and pay the usual wage." Earlier that afternoon, after leaving the mercantile, Matilda and Mabel walked home without a word about the porch. At the cabin, Matilda hung a blanket near the stove and held out her hand for the dress. Mabel changed behind it and passed the flour sack dress over without looking at the faded letters. She didn't ask whether she would have to wear it when Sunday came. Matilda saw the question anyway. At supper that night, Mabel looked at the thin pot, then at her mother. Matilda told her only that they were saving towards something. After supper, Matilda took up her needle by lamplight and turned the seam under a second time. When she held the cloth near the flame, the ghost of the miller's stamp still showed through the weave. She set the needle down without saying it could not be helped. The dress hung over the chair back between them, and neither of them touched it again that night. Before first light the next morning, Matilda moved the pans so Mabel would not see how far the stain had crept overnight. She burned the lamp no longer than she dared, sorted the mending by what could wait, and cut the kindling smaller than the stove wanted, so the wood pile would stretch. That afternoon, Mrs. Sullivan found the cabin at the end of the north road, smoke thin above the chimney. Matilda was at the wood pile splitting kindling with a hatchet a size too large for her hands, breathing harder than she wanted her visitor to notice. Mrs. Sullivan lifted the bundle before Matilda could mistake it for charity. Church aprons. They need mending before Sunday. Same wage as last time. Matilda set the hatchet against the wood pile and wiped her palms on her apron before she took the bundle, her hands red and cracked from washing other people's linens for wages. She carried the aprons to the chopping block and set them away from the damp ground. Through the open cabin door, Mrs. Sullivan could see 2 pans set on the floorboards beneath water stains that had spread dark and wide across the ceiling. As she watched, Mabel came from the back of the cabin and knelt to slide one of the pans a few inches to the left quickly before her mother could come in and see how full it had gotten since. "Morning." Mrs. Sullivan stopped at the threshold. "Careful now. You'll wet your hem." Mabel looked up at her, then down at the pan, and made no answer, only nodded and set it back with both hands. Mrs. Sullivan looked past the girl to the bed against the far wall where a rag had been stuffed along the sill to stop a draft that had beaten it most nights. Above it, the ceiling boards had gone soft and gray, sagging faintly along a line that ran the length of the room. She nodded toward the tar paper nailed crooked over one corner and the feed sack stuffed into a gap near the chimney. That roof wants looking at before winter sets hard. Matilda took the hatchet back up as though the subject were closed. "The church buried my husband decently. I won't keep going back with my hands out." Mrs. Sullivan nodded toward the bundle on the chopping block as if to remind her why she'd come. "No one's asking you to. I only came about the mending. Same wages as last time." Matilda's shoulders eased a fraction, though her eyes stayed guarded, and she let the matter drop. Mrs. Sullivan did not press it further. She took her leave and walked back toward town with the picture of those 2 pans fixed behind her eyes and the draft she had felt at the threshold still cold against her ankles. At the church, Reverend Franklin had pried the cabinet door loose from its swollen frame and was working through brittle pages by lamplight. Baptism records, building fund tallies gone soft with damp, a receipt for window glass dated long before he came to town. Mice had been at the lower shelf, and he lost the better part of an hour separating pages that could still be read from pages gone to lace. He found nothing at first but small hints, a margin note reading Dawson Lumber, no charge, a line in a building fund page where a roof repair had been budgeted and then crossed through with no sum ever entered against it, as though the bookkeeper himself had not known what to do with a debt nobody meant to collect. He sat with those scraps a long while, feeling the strangeness of being new to a town with debts older than his arrival. It was near dusk when he found the loose page tucked between 2 bound years as though someone had meant to copy it properly and never got the chance. The ink had browned, but Whitcomb's hand was clear enough to read by lamplight. A storm, a Saturday night, rain coming through above the pulpit and the children's pews. Levi Dawson had climbed up in the dark with his own tools and his own boards and worked until Sunday morning. He had refused payment. Brother Levi Dawson would take no wage, saying no child ought to sit beneath a leaking roof in the Lord's house. The pastor was still holding the page when Mrs. Sullivan came in, cold air trailing her coat. "Reverend, their roof is worse than ours ever was." He looked at her, then down at the page again, and understood that the 2 things in his hands, an old debt and a new leak, were the same thing come due. 12 years late, he went to ring the bells the next morning, but Deacon Hollis caught him on the church steps first, hat in hand, uneasy. Ringing bells on a weekday will put a fright into half the town before they know it's not a fire. The building fund's thin as it is, and the ladies' aid box won't stretch past Christmas. Reverend Franklin kept the torn page in his hand. "This isn't every hard case. This is a debt with our own church's name on it." Hollis turned his hat once in his hands, not yet satisfied, his voice dropping. "There's another matter. Speak it out loud in front of the whole town, and you shame the widow along with the rest of us. Some things are better mended quiet." The pastor considered that longer than he considered the money. It was the one argument that gave him real pause, and he let the silence sit a moment. A debt paid quietly is still owed to a child who was laughed at in public. I won't fix one shame by building another. He did not raise his voice to say it, and he did not stay to argue further because by then the sky had lowered and everyone watching it knew the weather was turning. He walked to the church alone, took hold of the bell rope, and pulled. The mercantile emptied onto the street. The blacksmith set down his hammer mid-stroke. Schoolchildren came running with their slates still tucked under their arms, certain something terrible had happened. Matilda heard the bell from her cabin and went cold with the same certainty and walked toward town with Mabel's hand gripped tight in hers, already composing in her mind who among her neighbors might be sick or dying. By the time she reached the churchyard, it was full. Mrs. Grafton and Mrs. Pike stood near the gate. Ernest stood near the steps with his hat already off. Reverend Franklin did not climb onto anything, and he did not raise his voice. He lifted the torn ledger page so the churchyard could see it. I was asked this week to speak about respect, but the church's own book spoke first. He read Levi Dawson's name aloud and the line about the leaking roof, plain, without flourish, and let it sit in the cold air a moment before he went on. This church has sat under a sound roof for 12 years because Levi Dawson would not take a wage. His widow's roof is failing before winter. That is not charity we owe her. It is debt. No one spoke. Mrs. Grafton shifted her basket to her other arm, uneasy under so many turned faces. No one told us she needed help. Mrs. Sullivan didn't raise her voice. Need is not always announced. Sometimes it's worn thin at the elbows and sent home before it cries. Not everyone moved as quickly as the moment seemed to ask. An older woman near the fence offered good scraps from home, still sound in the middle, if it would help. Mrs. Sullivan shook her head. Scraps won't mend a family's name. Bought cloth and paid work will. Further back, a man muttered that the church couldn't go on being responsible for every widow in the county. Reverend Franklin turned toward him. We're not taking on every widow. We're paying one particular debt. The man had no answer ready for that, and after a moment he took his hat off along with the rest. Ernest was the first to move. He knew roofs and would bring his tools by morning. The blacksmith offered nails on the spot. The sawmill owner hesitated. Most of his good boards were promised to a freight shed going up east of town, but his eyes moved to the ledger page still in Reverend Franklin's hand, and he decided the shed could wait a day. 2 of the churchwomen spoke up about sewing, real wages, not scraps, and the storekeeper offered to carry the Dawson account at cost through the winter. Matilda kept Mabel's hand in hers through all of it, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on some point past the crowd. When the pastor came to her at last and held out the torn page so she could read Whitcomb's words herself, her mouth pressed thin. She had always believed Levi had simply given a day's labor. She had not known he'd turned away payment outright, or that any man had thought it worth writing down. The pastor held the ledger page toward her. Your husband would not let children sit under a leaking church roof. Let us not leave his child under one. Matilda looked at the page a long moment before she folded it closed and handed it back. I'll take boards for the roof because Levi paid for them before I knew it. She looked once at Mabel, then back at the pastor. But if cloth comes into my house, I'll sew for it. No one argued the point. There was nothing in her voice that left room to. Ernest was on the cabin roof before the sun had cleared the ridge the next morning. 2 other men beside him stripping away the old tar paper and feed sacking board by board, while Mabel carried nails to the foot of the ladder in her apron pocket, careful not to spill them. The blacksmith's boy came by cart before mid-morning with 2 kegs of nails and would not take payment for either. The sawmill owner's wagon rolled in not long after, boards stacked and roped tight against the coming weather. Partway through the work, Ernest paused over a section near the chimney and ran his thumb along a patch fitted tighter than the rest, the joints closer than any hired man would trouble to make them. Somebody knew what they were doing here once. No one had to tell him whose hand it was. The edge above the north wall proved worse than anyone had guessed. The rafter beneath had gone spongy with rot, and Ernest spent the better part of an hour cutting it back to sound wood before he could nail anything new against it. eating into boards they had counted on, lasting the whole roof. By mid-afternoon, they were short of sound boards. A second wagon was to follow, but word came it had bogged in the low crossing, and the sky had begun to spit the first thin rain of the storm everyone had been watching for. Ernest stood at the edge of the roof counting what remained, jaw set, saying nothing. Mabel tugged her mother's sleeve. Papa kept boards behind the shed. The good ones. He wouldn't let me play near them. Matilda had forgotten or had not let herself remember. She led Ernest around back to a lean-to stacked with seasoned lumber under an old hide, dry and sound after all these years, cut and planed as if a man had meant to finish something he never got the chance to start. Ernest ran his hand along the grain and nodded once, and the work went on before the rain could thicken. Matilda tried to keep working through it all, hauling water, stirring the noon pot, carrying up more nails than anyone had asked for, until Mrs. Sullivan finally took the water pail out of her hands without a word and set it down herself, holding Matilda's eyes until she stopped reaching for it again. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Grafton came up the road alone, a folded length of blue wool under her arm and a smaller packet of brown cloth tied with string. She stood at a distance from the men on the roof, not quite at the door, and could not hold Matilda's eyes when she came near. She set the brown packet down first. "This is for the church children's coats at the wage the women agreed." Then she laid the blue wool beside it separate. "And this is part of that wage if you'll accept cloth for it for Mabel." Matilda looked at the brown packet first, then at the blue wool. Mrs. Grafton kept her hands folded in front of her. "I have a girl near Mabel's age. I should have remembered that before I spoke." Matilda took the brown packet first. Then she took the blue wool. "Then remember it next time before another child hears you." She did not turn the woman away, and she did not thank her warmly. She set both bundles inside, separate from each other, and went back to the work at hand. Mrs. Grafton nodded, accepting the correction, and went back down the road without lingering. The rain came in earnest that night, hard and steady, drumming on the new shingles until well past midnight. Matilda lay awake listening for the old sound, the drip finding the pan filling, the small metal note of it striking every few seconds in the dark. And it did not come. Mabel woke once beside her and lay still listening too, until she understood what she was hearing was nothing at all, and smiled before she went back to sleep. Later that week, the storekeeper marked her account at cost without being asked twice, and did not glance toward the door as though watching for anyone to notice his kindness. She thanked him plainly, and no more than the transaction required. Matilda cut the blue wool by lamplight over the following evenings, taking no more than the dress required and setting the scraps aside for mending later. She fitted it to Mabel twice, pins held between her lips, adjusting the hem herself rather than trusting the tape measure alone. It was a plain dress when it was finished, warm and well sewn, with no lace and no need of any. Sunday morning, Mabel stood at the cabin door in the new dress and would not step through it. She looked at the road instead of her mother. "I don't want to go. They'll remember the other dress." Matilda knelt and fixed the collar, though it did not need fixing, giving her hand something to do while she thought what to say. Before she found the words, Mabel found her own. She lifted her chin. "If Papa fixed the roof, I ought to go inside it." Matilda took her daughter's hand instead of answering, and they walked the road together. Their path took them past the mercantile, and Mabel's steps slowed near the bottom of the porch, her eyes finding the exact board where she had stood when the women laughed. Matilda did not pull her forward. She waited, her hand loose around Mabel's until the girl's own feet carried her past it and did not look back. The churchyard was full again, though quieter than it had been the day of the bell. The congregation had gathered early, but no one had gone inside yet. They were waiting for the Sunday bell to call them through the doors. Mrs. Grafton and Mrs. Pike stood near the gate as before. Mrs. Pike's eyes found the new blue dress, then dropped to the ground before Mabel reached her. No one laughed. Mabel kept her chin level and did not press her hand to her side because there was nothing there left to hide. And she walked the length of the churchyard at her mother's pace, neither hurried nor hidden. When the hour came, Reverend Franklin stepped away from the bell rope instead of taking hold of it himself. "Mabel, your father's hands kept this roof over us. Would you ring the bell this morning?" Mabel looked to her mother. Matilda nodded once. The girl took the rope in both hands and pulled. The bell swung and answered, carrying out over the churchyard, over the mercantile porch where she had once stood with her hand pressed to a seam, over the cabin roof that no longer needed pans beneath it, over the church roof her father had climbed in the dark to save. She was not this time a girl to be laughed at. She was Levi Dawson's daughter, and every person standing there knew it. And that was the story of Mabel Dawson, the flour sack dress, and the church bell that reminded a town who her father had been.